Well, hello to all of my methodical researchers out there. This video is going to cover some miscellaneous topics related to researching regulations. These are mostly things that I simply had to cut from the last video in the interest of not making it feature length. And we'll discuss the different parts of a regulation, how to read and understand them. We'll talk about using the Federal Register to explore the history of a regulation and find additional background information. We'll discuss using regulations to find cases, and we'll also go over how to update a regulation and ensure that it is still valid law. So we're just going to keep on with our example from our last video, the telemarketing sales rule, specifically the section here on abusive acts and practices. And scrolling over the text of the regulation, we can see that it really has the same basic format as the statutory law that we've encountered in some of our previous modules. And we're basically just going to use the same strategies to understand and comprehend the regulation, such as going very slowly and methodically through the language, focusing on the key nouns and verbs. And here, just looking at this subsection on debt relief services, we can see that this subsection is located under this subsection that specifies different types of abusive practices. So essentially, this makes requesting or receiving a payment for a debt relief service an abusive practice. And of course, we also know that debt relief services is probably an important term. So we would want to go to our table of contents, find our definitions section, and see if there's a definition of debt relief service in this definitions section. And it does look like we have one. So we would want to make sure that we parse this definition and make sure that the service at issue in our hypothetical would actually qualify as a debt relief service, because that is going to be a prerequisite for the application of the regulation. Okay, but going back to our section on abusive acts and practices, we can also see that the subsection that specifies that receiving or requesting this payment for debt relief services here is actually, it includes this phrase, until and unless. And that basically clues us in that this subsection here, it's really structured as a series of exceptions, basically. And we know that if any of these things applies to our hypothetical factual scenario, requesting the payment for a debt relief service is not going to be an abusive practice. Now, I'm not really going to look at these right now, and examine whether they would apply or anything like that, but I just want you to think about how to approach the structure and complexity that you'll run into when you're trying to comprehend regulatory law. And I also want you to realize that you're going to be basically running into these same types of structures that you encounter so often in codified law, such as exceptions, definitions, things like that. It's really not very dissimilar from other forms of codified law that we've looked at, but it does often tend to be more complex overall, so you might need to invest more time into reading and understanding a complex regulation. And one other quick thing that I do want to just briefly emphasize, something I also mentioned in my video eons ago about statutory research, and that's that you really need to be careful about your citations when you're dealing with this many kind of levels of the outline. It's really easy to mess it up. So you want to think carefully about your citation and double check it to make sure that you've got the correct citation and you're not mucking up one of these subsections or getting things out of order or anything like that. It's especially easy here to like miss this I after the 5 since it isn't indented. I don't know why. So yeah, you would actually cite, say, this here as 310.4 A5IC2. And yeah, that's pretty easy to get wrong. So just a word of caution. You do need to be careful with this stuff. So most of the different parts of a regulatory section that you'll encounter, they're going to be analogous to the stuff that we see in a statutory section. However, I do want to direct your attention to one part of a regulatory section that we just don't see in statutory law, and that's the authority field. And we can find that just by scrolling down past the text of the regulation itself, and also past our credits here. And here we go, authority. This is the statutory authority for the regulation. It's what we refer to as the enabling statute. And of course, it's also going to allow you to start from a regulation like this one and use it to also find associated statutory law. And that can sometimes be useful. Now also, as you can see, the usual style here is going to be just to reference the entire statute by noting the beginning section and the ending section. And that's why when in our last video we were using the statute here to find these regulations, we had to go to the beginning of the statute before we could use citing references to locate the associated regulations. Because when you're starting from one of those statutory sections that are in the middle, between 6101 and 6108, they are included, right? But they're not cited specifically by number in the regulation, so the citing references is not going to capture that. So you wouldn't be able to actually use one of those statutes in the middle to find the regulation that way. So using citing references is not foolproof in that particular situation. Just something to know. You need to be careful. And you should also note that this is a relatively simple situation in terms of statutory authority, in terms of enabling statutes. The enabling statute that we looked at and that is cited here clearly provided the only specific authority that the FTC could possibly really need to promulgate these regulations. I mean, it specifically told the FTC to do it. Other situations are often just not going to be quite that cut and dry, and it's really common for the regulation under this authority section to list almost like any statutes that might conceivably provide authority for the regulation, and just have a long list of different statutory authorities, and it can get somewhat confusing and not be quite as straightforward, so you might just end up with more information that you need to parse in this section here. Now, of course, we also have our familiar credit section. We saw this with our statutory law as well. And the difference here is that instead of referring us to session laws, things like that, this is going to instead, of course, refer us to where these regulations originate, the Federal Register. It's going to give us the citations for the final rule in the Federal Register that's associated with the original regulation here under source, as well as with any amendments to that regulation. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about researching regulatory history since it can get complicated pretty quickly. But you should be at least aware that the history that you see in this credit section, especially on Westlaw in particular, is just not exactly complete. This has definitely had more amendments that you see here. I know, in fact, that this regulation was promulgated well before 2010, even though we see this here. And that happens because Westlaw, for whatever reason, is often going to just stop when there's a really major revision of the regulation that kind of reenacts the regulation as a whole instead of sort of amending it piecemeal, and it'll sort of put it here in the credit section as if it was like the original version of it, when really it goes back further than that. So just be aware of that. So let's just take a quick look at the Federal Register citation that contains the final rule that our credit section is giving us as the source, the original regulation for this particular section. Not sure why it strands us in the middle of the footnotes here. Not ideal. But if we just start at the beginning here and start scrolling down, we can see that this really does contain a lot of prefatory material. The amendments that we're looking at, they specifically added those debt relief provisions to the regulation. So they discuss really extensively all of the agency's findings about debt relief, their rationale for the regulations that it adopted with this final rule, as well as responses to the comments and so on and so forth. All of those different things that I discussed in our section, in our video on the rulemaking process. And this stuff could be really helpful if there was a legit question about how this regulation should be interpreted, because it goes into so much detail. It's so explicit in discussing why the agency did what it did, why this particular regulation was adopted. And as we scroll down even further, it is pretty dense, pretty long, as you can see. Finally, okay, here are all of our different footnotes. And I just wanted to point out here that the FTC really does include just a ton of authority here to support its regulations. And the FCC does this because they know that if they don't present a carefully reasoned justification with lots of evidence to support its position, its reasoning behind the regulations that it did adopt in this final rule, any regulations that it promulgates could just very easily get struck down, and they'll have to basically start from, square one. And if we scroll down further, so much stuff. Scroll down further, here we go. We can see the text of the regulation. And here we actually just have the entire text as it appears in the chapter of the CFR. And that's because this was just a wholesale revision. It was all, however, based on this previous regulation. And you could just use this citation to the Federal Register that's linked here to look at that previous version that's way before, that 2010 version that we're looking at. The reason that we get that in our Westlaw citation is simply because when they did this amendment, it was basically like they redid the entire section, even the sections that maybe didn't change that much with the revision. So yeah, that is just an introduction to the Federal Register and how you can really easily start from the CFR section and navigate to the final rule in the Federal Register, and that can really help you find this very potentially useful background information on the regulations and their purpose and all of that stuff, the evidence backing them up, those things. But let's go ahead and go back to the CFR. Now, in your research, it's no surprise that you're also going to want to find cases that interpret the regulations that you found. We're going to do that just as we did with statutory law. And our core tools for doing that are going to be pretty similar to what we saw with statutory law as well, so this should be pretty easy for you to pick up overall. Now, our annotations, which we find in the same Notes of Decision tab, they are selected by the editors at Westlaw for their significance, and then they're organized under these headings that you see here, which are designed to mirror that procedural order of litigation. And this is usually going to be the first place you would want to look, since these cases are actually, curated by editors. They're chosen for their importance. Do note that, of course, these annotations are exclusively going to capture decisions of the courts interpreting this regulation. It is not going to cover any administrative decisions when, maybe an administrative judge at the FTC interprets this regulation. Depending on the field, those administrative decisions might actually end up being, more important than the decisions of the court in terms of, practical significance. But with annotations, we're only going to get, the judicial decisions. Now, if we need more, and also just to find more cases, we can also use our Citing References tab. And for cases, we would need to narrow the content type to cases. And we would probably also want to scroll down here to jurisdiction and narrow by jurisdiction just to make, the sheer number of these cases a little more manageable. And once we do that, we can see that we only have 5 cases from the 11th Circuit that cite this particular regulatory section. And we can also note that some of these cases are from the federal appendix, and that, as you know, means that they are unreported. So we would want to avoid using them unless there just isn't anything else available. And when we do use them, if we decide to, we would want to make sure to check the court rules to ensure that we're complying with, the way that they want us to use these unpublished or unreported cases. And we can also use our filters here to take a look at other administrative materials that reference this regulation. So we'll clear out the case filters, and then filter by administrative decisions and guidance, and then just administrative decisions. And we can see that even though it says administrative decisions, these are really more akin to miscellaneous agency materials. We have, different press releases and just kind of various agency documents that cite this regulatory section here. Now, these can sometimes be pretty helpful, although you do need to get more familiar with the area of law, how the agency operates, know more about their regulatory scheme in order to sort of place these sort of more random documents in context, and you'll need that context to effectively use them. So let's go back to the regulation. And just for a minute, I do want to mention updating regulations so you can ensure their validity. I'm sure that you did notice this yellow flag here, indicating that we do need to be cautious before using this particular source, this regulation. And we would, of course, need to click on that flag to find out more. That takes us to that history tab, the validity section. And really, this process, it works just like it did with statutory law. And it looks like there is some negative treatment from this 10th Circuit case, which reconsidered this regulation somehow. I'm not sure what they mean by that, resulting in that yellow flag. And of course, if we were in the 10th Circuit, we would want to check this out, and make sure that it doesn't affect the validity of the regulation for our purposes. Now, since we're in the 11th Circuit, and since this is just kind of a caution flag, it's probably not that relevant for us. But regardless, we always want to make sure to take a moment to explore any potential negative treatment. And even if this isn't, a negative signal that really impacts, our purpose for research, it might even be helpful just to look at it to, take a look at the court's analysis that resulted in that negative treatment. Okay, so one more thing that I need to show you. Let's pull up this regulation, which has been updated very recently. It's been amended. So the last amendment to it took effect on July the 1st. And that amendment was actually promulgated on June 29th. So yeah, super recently. And when you encounter a brand new regulation like this, you really need to be careful about how you cite it, because there is a really good likelihood that even though we're seeing it in our version of the CFR that we have on Lexis, it has not probably been officially published in the CFR. And we need to make sure on that point before we cite to the CFR without any qualification. So I'm just going to go ahead and Google official CFR. Update schedule. And I just want to go to the CFR on govinfo.gov. That's like the official source. And from this page on govinfo.gov, if we scroll down a little bit, it gives us the update schedule for the different titles. Remember, I mentioned this sort of staggered schedule that the updates have for the CFR. This is exactly how it works. And we know that our regulation that we were looking at is actually in Title 16. And Title 16 is not going to be updated again until next January. So we know that this most recent update is not going to be reflected in the official text of the CFR yet. And that means that you need to make sure that in your citation that you indicate this by also referring to that Federal Register citation for that last amendment. You know, it's more of a formality than anything else, but just something that does come up, something that I want you to be aware of. Okay, so now I'm on Lexis. I just want to briefly show you, the same stuff that we just talked about to the extent that it is available on here. So yeah, we're at that same section of the telemarketing sales rule on abusive telemarketing acts or practices. We've got the same regulatory text. We do want to note that just for this particular regulation, Lexis does not give us an authority note. Lexis is just simply kind of inconsistent about this. I can't figure out any rhyme or reason as to why it's included for some regulations and why it's not included for others. But if you wanted to look at the authority for this particular regulation, you would actually need to pull up the final rule in the Federal Register. However, you can also see that, for whatever reason, the history that you get here on Lexis is just much more complete than what you could find in the credit section of Westlaw. It doesn't stop in that with that 2010 amendment that we were looking at. It goes all the way back to the original promulgation of the rule back in 1995. So, if you were doing more extensive research into regulatory history, Lexis might actually be a better choice in this situation. And of course, you've got your annotations in Lexis as well, except as always, they're going to be located after the text. So we can find them here, along with our headings here. And these are going to give us, our summaries. These have been chosen by Lexis as being the most significant cases that interpret this regulation, but it is, again, not going to capture like those administrative decisions that might interpret the regulation. In order to find those and to find, additional cases, we would need to go to related content, find references to this administrative code. And once we've done that, we would go to select categories and just choose the category of our choice. If we wanted cases, here we go. And court is going to give us the ability to filter by jurisdiction. And it's also worth noting that we don't see a Shepard signal on Letsys for this particular section of the CFR. It's not capturing with its signal, that particular 10th Circuit case that reconsidered the section on abusive telemarketing acts or practices. We could get a fuller picture of that by Shepardizing the document and just finding any possible interpretive authority. And it does. We go to warning. It does give us, another negative case, more negative treatment that we didn't even see using the signals on Westlaw. So they can often just come to very different results. But like here, when we're trying to assess the validity of a regulation, the same basic principle that applies to assessing the validity of other sources of law would apply here as well. And that's just that we need to really look into the negative treatment. We need to read the case and see whether that negative treatment is actually relevant to the purpose for which we want to use this regulation. It might just be something completely irrelevant that is not related to our purpose at all. And when we're dealing with stuff that's just outside of our jurisdiction completely, like this negative treatment here, it's not necessarily that relevant to us, but we may want to take a look at it just to, look at the analysis that this court did on this particular regulatory section, which will improve maybe our understanding of how it works and about any potential issues that might arise under it. But there you go. We've really covered quite a few aspects of reading and using regulations in this one video. We talked about some strategies for reading and comprehending regulations, as well as some of the different parts of the regulations, such as the section directing us to the statutory authority. Then we talked about finding the final rule in the Federal Register to get that additional information about the background of the regulation that can often be pretty helpful in interpreting it and understanding it. And after that, we discussed updating regulations to ensure that they're still valid. And we also briefly went over dealing with those new regulations so that your citation always reflects the official text of the CFR. Okay, that's all I have for now. Until next time.